Right. Well, welcome everybody to Expert Talks Online. I'm Becky Smith, the product consultant here at Equal Experts. This morning, I'm delighted in welcoming long-standing EU product consultants, Neha Datt and Marcel Bridge.
Hey.
Woo.
Hello.
Both Neha and Marcel have been with us for a number of years, both with experience ranging from working in tech startups to supporting organizations transform to become more product and customer centric. Today, Marcel and Neha are drawing on their experience to talk us through product practices. Oh, sorry, I've realized that we've got a slightly different title here to the one that I've got, but why following customer needs and outcomes is not enough.
It was a little bit our fault. It's the same talk. You're totally right, Becky. We
okay.
Adjusted the title a little bit because we felt it was maybe confusing. So no worries.
Okay, fine. I'm not in the wrong place.
No, and everyone else is on the right place as well.
Okay, good. Thanks. Just to let you know that once the talk is finished, we'll run a Q&A session as time permits. So you can start adding your questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of Zoom. So just as they come to you, just add them in, and then you can actually vote on them as well. So what will happen is at the end of the talk, the ones that have been voted the most popular are the ones that we will start with, and we'll just try and get through as many as we can in the time that we've got. So yeah, I mean, without further ado, please let me hand over to Neha and Marcel.
Awesome.
Thanks,
Thanks, Becky.
Yeah, do you want to kick off and then I'll jump in?
Yeah, sounds good. So I guess maybe just to frame this talk a little bit, this talk kind of has come from experiences that Marcel and I have both had. So we've witnessed kind of firsthand a combination of sometimes very frustrated customers, employees from our clients, you know, who might feel like they've been ethically compromised, or in some cases, even businesses that are going down a very unsustainable path, even though the teams, the product teams, the delivery teams are actually following product best practices. So what we wanted to do is actually talk about how modern product practices, if they're not practiced with a bit of nuance and with care and within context of the organization, they can actually be quite detrimental to businesses, customers, and employees. So we're going to share some examples. We'll share some very specific tools as well that we've read about, some which we've used. And we're hoping that even if you don't take something very tangible and specific out of this talk, this at least serves as a bit of a thought piece so you can have conversations with your teams afterwards.
Yeah. And we should also say maybe this isn't only targeted to product people, because ultimately everyone, whether you're in tech, user experience design, QA or whatever, you all make kind of explicit or implicit decisions on how a product evolves. It's a bit easier if you're the lead product owner or manager in a startup versus maybe being a consultant where you're sometimes just being asked to do as you're being told. But at the same time, you can always provide opinion and advice. So I think this is for everyone who works on services and products.
Yeah, great.
Right. Shall we jump in?
Let's do it.
So I want to tell you a little bit of a story first, just to set the scene. So I want to talk about a startup that is kind of in an amazing position where they were working in the medical space and had this idea that with a single drop of blood, you could on that drop of blood, you could conduct up to 100 blood tests within minutes at really, really low cost. And therefore they could revolutionize the kind of healthcare blood testing industry, especially considering that this is in the US and where blood tests are quite expensive. And so they had this kind of strong optimism bias, like a positive thing for a startup, as we think, where they were really believing in their product and their value proposition. They also, on the back of that, built a really strong brand and massive credibility. So just looking at the people they were able to get on the board. So there was like former Secretary of State George P. Shultz, Henry Kissinger was on the board, or is on the board, former defense secretaries, admirals, generals, the CEO of Wells Fargo. Biden came along for a visit to the company. They raised 1.3 billion funding from Murdoch and others, had a 9 billion valuation, were run by a very charismatic young female CEO. And in terms of going about their business, they really followed kind of what we're all talking about. So lean experimentation, so rolled out an initial device, put that device in Walgreens supermarkets for tests, but ran the tests also on established devices by established companies in parallel to make sure that everything was going well. And they also created a lot of IP and, you know, to commercialize on that IP later, and loads of other things, good things they did. So Neha, what, if is that a company you would be wanting to run? I mean, what do you think?
Ticks all the boxes, right? In terms of how we want to work, like it's iterative, it's lean, it's customer centric, 100%.
Right. So problem is that they're now bust and in court for defrauding investors and defrauding customers, patients. There is a case where they misdiagnosed, or it is alleged that there was misdiagnosis and the woman either miscarried over it or was told she had a miscarriage or something similar, horrible. So for those who kind of have read the media, I mean, obviously, that's weird. Can you see that? Ah, here we go. Sorry, that didn't build up properly. We're talking Terranos, right? So Elizabeth Holmes, CEO, if you haven't heard of this or read about it, it's absolutely fascinating, the story. Read John Carrero's book, Bad Blood. We're not talking about startups specifically. We're not talking about Terranos specifically, but it's such a good example of what can go wrong, even if you have an amazing value proposition, that things still might not turn out. So let's talk a little bit about like what may have gone wrong. And I'm saying may have gone wrong because this is in court as we speak. People are being deposed and interviewed right now. So we can only infer from what the journalists, and there were some really thorough journalists, you know, investigating the business, what they have deduced. But it doesn't actually matter. I don't really care whether this is a Terranos specific case. It's just like, well, what can we learn generally? So, you know, the problem kicks in, I think, when, you know, you have this amazing vision, but effectively what happens is that you never actually have a product that really works. And all the scientists that are in the industry tell you that actually it can't work, because with one drop of blood, the type of blood you're drawing has too many lipids in it. So you can't do those blood tests you're talking about. It's not enough volume, et cetera, et cetera. But you start believing your own myth because of the press and because of the people you have around you, et cetera, et cetera. And maybe you silence the ones that are raising criticism because you don't want to hear it. And the VCs and investors are kind of putting too much pressure on. So,
and also, Marcel, isn't it like commonly said that actually as a startup founder, you kind of need to be a little bit mad, and that's a story that's really embraced, right? So then that's further enforcement that you have for your belief in yourself and your product and the potential.
Absolutely, and we have seen that with Elizabeth Holmes, where she went so far that she claimed at some point there was a conspiracy against her, that this, you know, that the big pharmaceutical companies didn't want her to be successful. And to be fair, that's maybe not too far-fetched, but when you then look at the other stuff, it all doesn't come together. I mean, there was apparently, this comes to the next point about snake oil and vaporware, there was apparently at no point in time a functioning product. Also, if you look at the people on the board, sounds all good to attract money, but who are these people? They're all like white 80-plus-year-old dudes which had loads of power in the past, maybe believe they can shape reality in their own image, but none of them was an engineer. None of them had any experience in the medical arena, like the board we're talking about here. So, and then obviously, you know, you want to experiment lean, but you don't really want to be sloppy or not deliver at all. So Walgreens at some point killed their partnership in 2016 when they heard that Terranos was voiding around 10,000 of blood tests, avoiding or correcting 10,000 blood tests. And as part of that, however, their CFO, I believe, had massively inflated their revenue predictions based on that they could do all those blood tests. So at that point, it started all to crumble because there was no product that even had a trajectory of becoming successful. And then finally, you know, patent trolling. I mean, I think patents are good to kind of, you know, protect innovation, but at the same time, right now there is a court case by SoftBank, who happen to find themselves owning some of the ex-Terranos IP against the COVID startup or COVID testing startup, and they're suing them because of IP infringement. I'm like, when it gets to that point where it just sue people left, right, and center because you're paranoid about your IP or you want to kind of stifle growth of other companies, then you know it becomes very detrimental.
Yeah.
So yeah, Neha, what do you think now, and how does it relate to the talk we are kind of we're presenting here?
Yeah, it's exactly case in point. You know, like this is why we do need a bit of a new perspective in terms of, you know, what it means to follow best practice. I mean, this was a specific example about a startup and quite a spectacular failure, but we actually see examples, smaller examples of this every other week, you know, when we work with different teams in different industries. So it's about like looking at product management best practices in a slightly different way. So, focusing on outcomes and customer needs isn't good enough anymore. Good practices, unfortunately, can have very unintended consequences. And I think it's really important that as people working in organizations, we accept the fact that we always have an impact, always. It's our choice, however, whether that impact is intended or unintended. So our goal is to make sure that we're aware of the unintended impacts, and we do something about this. It's a bit about kind of making the unknown unknowns known, so you can actually make conscious decisions. So if we move on, I think it's about redefining good practice, because as product teams, we do have a responsibility. And, as mentioned a little bit earlier on, we have a responsibility to customers to make sure that we leave them better off, having used our products and services. We've got responsibility to employers as well, to highlight their blind spots, like leadership teams. They're not on the ground. They don't know some of the decisions and trade-offs that are being made. So it's really about sort of highlighting some of the blind spots so that they are aware of some of these trade-offs that are being made. And also ultimately, they're next on the line. So if there's any spectacular failure, they're the ones who have to actually go out, speak to the public. There's reputational damage, they lose their jobs. So they have to be aware of some of these trade-offs. And then lastly, we do have a responsibility to our colleagues as well working in organizations. We need to have those difficult conversations. And we know that by having difficult conversations, we actually increase trust in teams. And that also results in an increase in psychological safety. So it's really about being able to talk about the elephant in the room. And in some cases, even just discovering that there is an elephant in the room.
You should also say maybe just quickly that there is no black or white in this, right? This all depends on your ethical stance. It depends. There's interesting research out there that suggests that even moral values are very, very cultural specific. I mean, as we know, and we sometimes, because we are coming, or a lot of us, sorry, not we, but a lot of us, I come from a white Western background, have very different perception of what's right or wrong than maybe someone else who comes from a different culture. So we're not suggesting that it's very simple, but that it's worth to think about these things and have at least a clear stance to those.
Yeah, definitely. So we've put together quite a list of sort of practices, unintended consequences, and some antidotes. We're not going to have the time to go through all of those today, but what we will do is we'll take you through a couple just as a bit of a taster, and we're going to pull out a couple of examples. There's 4 examples that Marcel and I feel quite strongly about, so we'll talk through those. And yeah, as Marcel said, there's no black or white. So it's really about figuring out what does that slippery slope look like, and how do we start to have some of those deliberate conversations.
Cool. Sorry, this is not building up. We're going through these quite quickly. I think you'll get the gist. So this is the first one that's close to my heart, is innovation, right? We're being told that innovation is important for businesses, that there is a lot of value in innovation, differentiation, competitive advantage. And when we talk innovation, we're talking about innovation in the tech space, but also in the process and business model space. So any point where there is something, an invention or innovation kind of added to something and something new is created or used in new ways. The problem with that is that innovation, if you choose the wrong new technologies or the wrong new business model, it can become unsustainable. Unsustainable for the business because you're making the wrong choices too early, and you're maybe putting technology in place that you're not ready for, or that will close as options too early, or business models that just have a wider impact on sustainability, on the environment, or on the common economy even. Classic example, I've recently worked with at least 3 clients who all wanted to do something with blockchain. It's just because blockchain is the thing. It's fashionable. It's cool. Everyone wants to have a bit of it, to do something with it. None of these clients had a valid reason why they should have had blockchain. There was nothing that blockchain could have solved in any shape or form better than a normal database for these clients. Considering then that blockchain is quite questionable in terms of, or any decentralized ledger technology is quite controversial in terms of energy usage, in terms of all the Ponzi schemes and the pyramid schemes we have seen with it, etc., etc. It's really too easy to just jump to a solution, choose that solution because everyone else seems to be doing it. Rather than really thinking that through. All of those 3 clients have decided that they won't go for distributed ledger technology at this point in time. Nea made and I had a chat about Elon Musk. From what I understand, initially he thought about selling cars via Bitcoin, and then people again mentioned the point that his entire proposition of having more sustainable automotive model, that obviously would kind of be contradictory to using Bitcoin because of the mining, the energy cost of Bitcoin mining. I mean, there are numbers bounced around for those who don't know that, you know, Bitcoin uses as much energy as Ireland does, right? So we're talking huge amounts of energy here. So I think from what I understand, Elon Musk then was like, well, okay, maybe we won't accept Bitcoin because it just doesn't work with our value proposition.
Or with our values, right? Our overall mission for his businesses and the values, yeah.
Correct. Now, do you want to talk a little bit about business models, just briefly?
Yeah, so I mean, like, I guess one, you know, quite a contentious one is around sort of the gig economy, you know, which was obviously made popularized through Uber, and the fact that while it offers great choice for consumers, so as someone who's, you know, hailing a car, yes, I have great options, but that comes at a human cost as well. So, you know, there's a downward push on wages and rights, etc., for the workers, for the drivers. So it's really important, again, it's not to say whether something is right or wrong. It's about saying, understand what the human costs are going to be and are there things that we can do to try to sort of combat maybe some of those human costs.
So really to kind of then wrap that up in terms of why we need to think about this is that fashionable isn't always good or always right? And everything is contextual, right? So you need to see, where are you as an organization, where do you want to go, what are your goals, what are your capabilities, where is the technology in the maturity cycle that you want to use, and then make the right choices. So the antidote, as we recommend, is, I mean, responsible innovation, that's a big word, but specifically what you can do is impact analysis on the choices you make, be just really aware of what the closer the wider impact is. And then this, you know, as I just outlined, contextual technology assessment, we're really clear about what are the right technology choices to drive my goals at this point in time. So I think just looking at time, Neha, do we want to jump to the next one maybe, just to give a bit more flavor?
So personalization, you know, so why is it good? Because it caters to customers' preferences, and we believe that ultimately results in better retention of customers and loyalty. So fairly uncontroversial there, but there can be some unintended consequences, because when we're providing experiences that customers want, you know, what we're also sometimes doing is we're creating an echo chamber, because all we're doing is we're exposing customers to what they prefer, what they're comfortable with. What that can also mean is that it becomes harder to discover new things, new content, new people, etc. And that creates social bubbles. So one example is, let's say, Netflix. I'm sure many of you've been using Netflix and you've seen that the images that there are for the videos, they change. And the idea is that, and of course, I don't know the details around the algorithms, but the idea is that the images will change and Netflix will learn over time what attracts you. So you can imagine a situation where, let's say, you know, if you're a white person, you know, what is familiar to you are white faces. So you might respond more positively to, let's say, images of white people. So all of a sudden, the diversity starts to disappear from your Netflix feed, because actually you're being presented with what you are most comfortable with and what you're most attracted to. And what that does is that can then entrench biases that we already have. So while we totally accept that, you know, it's important to cater to what customers are attracted to, we absolutely need to be thinking about some of the drivers that people have when they do certain things, and sort of really combat that. So thinking about echo chambers, you not only lose sight of diversity, but you can also, as I mentioned, you know, find it harder to discover things. And one thing that we know that does happen when it comes to recommendations engines is that there's a lot of affinity modeling going on. So even if, let's say, you're creating a bit of an echo chamber, you are presented with potentially new content, so whether it's movies or videos, etc. But it's often based on other people who are like you, who are behaving like you. So even though you might be discovering new things, again, you're still existing within a single social bubble. So it's much harder then to understand and experience content that, you know, other people would be experiencing who might have completely different preferences. And I think that's not a very extreme example, but there are some more extreme examples that we've spoken about in the past, Marcel.
Yeah, I mean, you've all heard about like Cambridge Analytica during the US elections, and the impact Facebook had in terms of their algorithmic choice and what content you should be seeing. So these are kind of very obvious examples, but I think that the point is that everything that we personalize, I think we just sometimes need to see, are we personalizing too closely? Is this becoming too narrow? I have the problem on Medium, for instance, that I get articles that I'm no longer interested in because there's certain topics that I was interested in a year ago and I can't get rid of them. It just won't, kind of whatever I do, I think I need a new profile there. And that's just feels wrong somehow.
Yeah, and I guess one of the ways to kind of combat that, so when we think about what could the antidotes be, one is to have very difficult conversations about what are the deliberate trade-offs here. So in the case of personalization, you know, there's a trade-off here between personalization and potentially sort of profits. So what we're saying is, you know, do we really want to give people exactly what they want, or do we sometimes want to maybe combat that a little bit and make sure that there's more diversity in people's feeds, for example? So one way that we've done that in the past is to have things like tension scales, where you put two opposing concepts on a scale and you figure out where do we draw that line and what's that cost that we're willing to kind of take on as a business.
Cool. Right. So I think you get the gist now where we're going with this. Very, very briefly then. So it seems to be good practice, and I agree with that you should be data-driven, right? Insights deliver better value, better services, you know, that you can make better choices. Also, there is value in the data itself, which is maybe a bit more contentious, but, you know, for a startup to gather data, that makes sense. The problem with this is that you can be overconfident with what you think you can get from the data. A lot of the times when we use training data for machine learning models, I find that the data is in parts maybe biased already, that the data sets are relatively small in some cases. So that is a problem. There's a race to the bottom that can happen when we focus on efficiencies. So if you think some of the pricing algorithms we see in Amazon and other marketplaces can push prices down and make, you know, lead to monopoly forming. We've seen in the healthcare industry that there is a drive to do AI-based diagnosis, and that can lead to problems down the line where those models might not be as good as we think they are. Babylon had big criticism from some NHS GPs about their GP at hand AI. But also some of those models are all in the interest of increasing efficiencies. And that can lead again to then if you need to, the more efficient you need to be, especially in healthcare provision, that can then mean that you actually compromise on the quality of service. And then, of course, you can abuse data, right? So I don't know, Nea, do you want to talk a little bit? We spoke about surveillance quite a bit.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, there's a lot of a lot of concern in many societies these days about, like, you know, CCTVs coming up everywhere, you know, surveillance taking place. And again, like, we don't know what's exactly happening with a lot of that data. I mean, while, you know, it sounds great that, you know, we have these mechanisms in place to prevent crime or, you know, to help with sort of to convictions. But ultimately, we know that at the extreme, that can also be used for enforcing social compliance. So again, it's a very slippery slope, you know, and we're not part of those conversations that slowly start moving the needle towards greater social enforcement.
Yeah. So really here, the antidote is, again, check your biases, make sure that you're really working on data that's as objective as you can get it, which is, of course, really, really hard. Define, I would suggest, as an organization, an ethical stance. And even if that's like, well, we're okay with selling rockets or landmines or weapon systems, that's okay, but be explicit about it, right? And be aware of the impact that they may have. And then with data, just don't be greedy. I think there's always this thing that you should really only capture the data you actually need, and not you know, just over collect. There's more in this, but I think that gives a good view. So let us come to the maybe the final one on this.
Yeah, and we'll just quickly go through this one. So loyalty, it's great because we know that results in longer term business viability because you've got loyal customers who keep sticking around. So your costs of obviously acquiring or retaining customers kind of goes down. But some of the unintended consequences are things like addiction. So, you know, we often hear product teams talk about stickiness, the stickiness of their product. And there are some very nefarious practices that get put in place in order to make sure that people keep coming back, you know, and we basically encourage some addictive behavior sometimes, particularly with apps. You know, sometimes that can also result in resentment. So we've seen, you know, a number of businesses actually tend to lock in customers, and that's kind of seen as loyalty because customers aren't leaving. So on the outside, it might seem like they're loyal, but actually customers don't have much choice, and it's much harder for them to leave than it is to kind of stay with the business. And you could argue that's a form of bullying as well. And I think we can all kind of relate to that when it comes to energy companies, some infrastructure companies, and so on. And then lastly, it can also result in overconsumption because we try to push retention and in some cases repurchases, subscription models, those sorts of things. forcing consumption beyond what people actually need, and sometimes beyond what they even want. So we have to think very carefully about loyalty, and understand that loyalty doesn't necessarily mean that we have happy customers. So just looking at that single metric doesn't mean that our customers are willingly staying with us. And what that also means is that, you know, we need to kind of think a little bit more about viability in a more holistic way. So not just thinking about the single metric, but, you know, thinking about things like people's happiness, thinking about, you know, how broad the competitive landscape might be as well for us, and so on. So in terms of the antidote, one of the things is to kind of redefine what customer acquisition costs are. You know, at the moment, like generally we tend to look at things like advertising costs, marketing costs, but actually we should think about the personal costs as well. Some of those hidden costs or of actually acquiring customers. And a lot of this might be qualitative, you might not be able to quantify it, but even having those conversations then adds some nuance and context to those financial figures that you're putting together. There's also something about circuit breakers. Did you want to maybe talk about the circuit breakers, Marcel?
I mean, just quickly, it's basically to say, look, when you have infinite scroll, or you have like some kind of gambling system that allows you to kind of spend a lot of money on it, that at some point you just have this thing in there where you interrupt that, and you get the customer or the user out of that cyclic pattern, and you put some interrupt in place, that their mindset changes. Now we know that casinos in Las Vegas are doing exactly the opposite, because they want you to basically spend your life in the casinos and spend more and more money. But there are ways to kind of, if you're conscientious, to interrupt that pattern and get customers out of it, and, you know, to not fuel that addiction basically.
Exactly. And as people who work in businesses, we don't need to wait for the legislation to change to enforce these things. We can put in those circuit breakers without the law dictating us do so. And then lastly, just thinking about, again, things like customer satisfaction, making sure that we're measuring customer satisfaction and whatever health metrics we think we need to sort of counterbalance things like loyalty, and how we measure sort of retention as well. Cool. So should we move on?
Yes. So of course there is more. We've said there is like, we came up with a huge list. There is a table like this, which is just the first 3 rows. I think we have like 20 or so of best practices. And with each of those, we've brainstormed a little bit around anti-patterns, examples, takeaways, antidotes. It would be interesting to hear from you guys, where at the moment we're thinking, do we expand on this? Do we publish this? And I think it would be nice to get a little bit of feedback, whether people thought this was useful or helpful. Then we'll put the energy in. If people are like, look, we know all this already, and by the way, we think it's not that helpful for X, Y, and Z reason, then, you know, we might just not do it. So it would be good to hear from you guys. Also, please follow us on we'll share social media later, and if we share this, we'll kind of publish this on the usual channels. And for those of you who are going to Lean Agile Exchange later this month, we're speaking there as well, hopefully with a little bit of an updated version of this talk based on a little bit of the feedback we have from you guys. So Neha, do you want to talk a little bit like what can we practically do?
So I think one thing is to kind of reflect on, what am I thinking but not saying? So, you know, this could be about my products, about my services, about how my organization is functioning, the trade-offs, the decisions they're making, because there's always a difference, as we know, between how you feel about things and how you think about things. And a lot of us work in highly, you could say, intellectually challenging spaces. And so we have a lot of analytical discussions about, you know, concepts and trade-offs, etc., which is great. But oftentimes, you can still feel very uncomfortable about decisions that are being made, or you can feel very uncomfortable about a direction that you might be going in as a team. So it's about sort of understanding, you know, am I feeling uncomfortable about certain things that we're doing? You know, for example, do we have really aggressive franchising plans? And that goes against a personal belief that I have, which is that I don't want monopolies and I want to support small businesses. You know, is it that, you know, like there'll be lots of logical flaws in terms of, like, you know, some of the decisions that are being made in terms of the company strategy. But what's really important is to kind of be quite mindful and be quite humble about, you know, perhaps we might be on the wrong journey. Perhaps there's more to, you know, what we're doing and why we're doing it. And it's about sort of having those conversations in teams. And I think, Marcel, you and I were talking about, you know, anthropologists, and they have like this great concept, isn't it, about kind of looking outside in.
Oh, sorry. Yes. So the idea is basically that it's very easy to kind of get lost in your own kind of myth and you know, there's groupthink in there, and if you work within the same company, just to believe your own little myth that you're spinning, and I think that is important, right, to a degree, because otherwise if you have no confidence in your product. But there is something to be said about taking a step outside, looking at it from the outside, and saying, look, if I had to present this to someone else, in the pub or to the wider public, does that actually sound credible? Does that sound true? Can I really stand behind this? It's a little bit like, you know, sometimes when we say, would you say to people in a pub what you're writing to them on Twitter, right? It's the same kind of thing, you know. So this outside in is basically just taking a little bit of a step back with more awareness and looking at it with a bit of a more kind of detachment. And I think that is quite important for you know, to get a more balanced view on what you're actually doing. It's very easy to get very hyped up as a team and forget that there is actually reality out there.
Yep. And so we've got a couple of tools here that we've listed here, which you can look up. We can share the links afterwards if you're interested when we post the talk. But the first one is to have the difficult conversations. So in the top left corner, you can see TRIZ. It's an exercise. It's a liberating structure. So it's a type of exercise you can do as a team. And you ask yourself like these really catastrophic questions, like if an evil warlord wanted to use our product to help them with their evil machinations, you know, how are we actually enabling them? Or, you know, how could we break society with our product or our service? And I think there's some really interesting things that we found when every single time we run a TRIZ exercise, whether we run it with government teams, whether we've run it for private companies, we've found that actually, I think you've got some good examples, Marcel, but it's always been quite, it's quite surprising, because when we talk about some of these catastrophic outcomes, we find that—
yeah. Sorry, go on. Yeah.
Yeah, like almost every team has already started down a very slippery slope.
Yeah, so what we found was we ran this with, in one case, I think with a government kind of team of government civil servants, and we basically asked them, like, how would you make the workplace as bad as possible? And people came up with all these Orwellian ideas around, like, you know, CCTV and not allowing people to talk to their peers, or you know, and just build up a really dystopian work environment. And the funny thing was, even the craziest examples we came up with, someone in that room invariably said, that's happening at my place of work right now. And I've seen this every time I'm running this with organizations, where we come up with these super dystopian scenarios, what could happen with their product. Someone's like, yeah, I've experienced exactly that in the past somewhere else. So this is not totally out there. This is actually all, unfortunately, all real and realistic.
Exactly. And then, like, once we've sort of had these conversations, we mentioned tension scales. So thinking about, you know, the trade-off between like profit and addiction, you know, let's have that very honest, difficult conversation as teams, and make sure that we include our leadership teams as well in some of those conversations. Because I think one of the comments that I saw coming through in the Q&A was around, what can we do, given that oftentimes we in delivery teams aren't actually empowered to make some of the decisions. You know, there are revenue targets, there are customer acquisition targets. And so, you know, we might not feel like we're actually empowered in order to be able to influence the direction that we go in. But what we can do is we can have these conversations and we can elevate them to the leadership teams and make sure that they 100% sign off and buy into the trade-offs that are being made. Because ultimately the risk and the reputational damage sits with them as well. And then to sort of facilitate that, you can see that there are some canvases here. So there's an ethics canvas that you can look up, but we'll also share the link to, that triggers some questions, and the ethical design prompts that we've got there as well. From One Dot, they're absolutely fantastic, really good probing questions that you can ask, no matter what your product or your service is, and it sort of brings out a lot of stuff to the surface. And lastly, in the bottom left corner, we've got circular metrics there. So rather than thinking about just loyalty, retention, revenue, etc., there's other metrics that also look at the longer term sustainability of how you work internally as an organization, but then also what you're building and the impact that you're having on society as well.
I just want to add one thing to this, just a question I saw in the Q&A come up, which I thought was interesting. So someone said, like, you know, what can we do as a delivery team? And, you know, because I think this was my point very early in the talk, that yes, it's very easy if you're the head of product in a big company and you can make all the choices you want to make within reason. And how is it if you're a software engineer on the ground floor and you're building software, or if you're a consultant and you're coming in from the outside, I think the thing here is that you can always have an opinion, and you should, and you can voice that opinion. Yes, of course, sometimes you'll just be told to do as, just fucking do it. But I think people appreciate opinions, and you can start a conversation around some of those things. And sometimes these shifts are cultural, and they take a little bit longer in an organization. But that doesn't mean you can't have discussions with your colleagues around things. And some of those things are not necessarily super big. In some cases, I think it's also about the technology choices we make on the ground floor. A good example is we are working with a client at the moment who has a microservice architecture, and they wanted a service mesh from day one. And we said to them, look, you don't need one. It makes things actually more complicated. You will want a service mesh once you have like maybe 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, or even more microservices, but not when you have 1 or 2. So talking people out of the wrong choices at the wrong time, that's a starting point. This is not a big ethical decision, but it still influences the business. And if you build too complex infrastructure too early on, it will impede your growth, and it will add hidden costs, etc. So there's lots of tiny decisions we can make on a day-to-day basis around these things.
Yeah, agreed.
Cool.
Right. So we have some questions.
We do indeed, yeah. I've put that delivery question down as answered. I hope that's okay. I hope everyone feels that's great. So we've got 3 questions here, but I've also noticed that there are some interesting statements that have been put into the chat. So if there's anything anyone has put into the chat that you would like us to discuss that isn't necessarily a question but more of a statement, if you could just pop it over into the Q&A, that would be really great. But we'll kick off with the first question, which is, I've heard the saying, don't fall in love with your own work, but also believe in your ideas. Any guidance to balance out the two?
One thing that we sometimes do, like Marcel and I, when we're working together, or even when we're not working together, is one of us will play the role of a critical friend. And that can actually be quite a powerful technique, where what you do is you have someone who basically plays, whether it's devil's advocate or call it whatever you like, but they almost take an opposite stance to where you're at. So if you're in the headspace of, I really want to believe that what we're doing is right, I believe in my product, etc., then the other person takes the opposite stance and they try to break your thinking. And to be honest, it's actually quite a scientific approach, in the sense that, that's exactly what taking a hypothesis-driven approach is about. You try to disprove your null hypothesis. So you're getting the other person to ask, pokey questions to try to stress test your thinking. And then you can flip it, and then flip the roles and actually try to see why do you think that actually you would back up your original position. So, I mean, that's like just one very specific technique that you could use, but I think it's important to have a balance of both. Like to be optimistic, but also know where your blind spots are.
And I think it's really important that when you think, depending on where you are in your career, I found that when I was younger and less experienced, it was important for me to have mentors and the right people you work with, people you can look up to, and you can ask them things and get feedback. The more experienced you get, those mentors will go away because they become less and less. But then what you need is I think what Neha and I are doing quite frequently, we're working even for different clients, different companies, and you need to be a bit careful with NDAs there, but generally speaking, you want a partner buddy, or someone you can bounce these ideas off from, and just go to the person and say, look, I'm doing this at the moment, that doesn't feel right, or that feels great, what do you think? The thing they had just mentioned. So just have someone at a professional level who you can really connect well with, and have that conversation. I think that's very, very important, and for career growth in general, but I think for that specific thing as well.
Yeah,
great.
Agreed.
Thank you. Okay, where do you draw the line between assuming our customers have agency versus they're victims and passive to the design decisions we make?
It's a good one. I mean,
yeah,
I think we have to acknowledge that while people do have agency, there are always subconscious drivers for why people do the things that they do. So the context that they're in, their personal biases and preferences, there are all these unsaid things that also impact a person's behavior. And I think it's not to necessarily say that a person has total agency or they're a total victim, but they're somewhere in the middle. And it's about understanding, by being in the middle, what are some of those unconscious drivers and biases that might be impacting their behavior and their choices, and how can we try to, in some cases, make them as explicit as possible. So for example, like, I've seen that there's I've forgotten the name of it, but there's an eco-friendly focused online marketplace where you can buy things like, washer pads made out of recycled cotton and, biodegradable dishwashing soap, etc. And they do have a subscription service, but they're very careful about making sure that you have a lot of options to make sure that you're not over-consuming, because that is in line with their values. So they'll do things like, because I subscribed for their dishwashing liquid, and it turned out that actually I wasn't using it as much as I thought I was. And they quite nicely send you a bit of a prompt to say, how are you going with this? You're going to have your new shipment sent in X weeks time, so there's ways in which I think that you can be quite conscious of the fact that, you might be having a negative impact on someone, or on the environment, but, you put in these sorts of circuit breakers, as Marcel called them, in order to kind of help.
Okay, I'm just thinking, I think I have nothing to add. I think I totally agree. I just think in the interest of time, do we want to jump to Thomas's question quickly, because I think that's an interesting one.
Yes, absolutely. These reflections you have, I've heard talked about or presented as a need to add ethical and sustainable to the common, desirable, viable, feasible balance. Keen to hear your reflections on a framework like that, or that specific example.
So I think that's an interesting one in the sense that I use that desirable, viable, feasible quite a lot, especially when I introduce clients to building products. I've actually just done this last week with a new client. Now, I would argue that ethical, sustainable is somehow in the viable, really, possibly in the desirable as well. So it's kind of implicit in that. But I think, to Neha's point about the canvases we had earlier, I think if you just have it in there, it might get lost. So I think there is possibly worth in having an ethics canvas or something like that, or some framework to, dig deeper into these areas on the side of that. But I don't think necessarily that we need another facet in this. I think it sits for me in viable, but you need to drill down, and then these other canvases and tools come in handy to analyze that a little bit more in detail. And I'm not sure what you think, Neha.
Yeah, because I think, I do like the idea of making it explicit, because then it forces the conversation. Whereas at the moment, you're absolutely right. Like, it's left up to individuals or individual businesses to make that call for themselves in terms of what they see viability as. So yeah, like, I can see it working in either way, but you're right. Like, longer term, ideally, we want to reshape what viable actually means for businesses.
It definitely needs explicit calling out, because it's for a lot of business, viable is about the bottom line, right? What's the sum on the P&L, on the balance sheet, and that's not good enough. So maybe you have a point that this for now needs a little bit more explicit pointing out.
Yeah, it's a good idea.
Great, thank you. Right, well, that's all the questions that we have. So thank you so much. That was amazing, really interesting. I really enjoyed it. I hope everyone else did. We have recorded this session, so we'll send that out to everybody once it's finished. I just want to say thank you so much to both Marcel and Neha. That was really great.
No worries. Thanks for joining in the morning.
Our next expert talks online is actually at the same time next week, and it is about when to adopt, you build it, you run it in an enterprise organizations, which will be with Steve Smith and Bethan Timmins, and I'm sure it will be very interesting. You can register using the QR code seen on the slide, which is very exciting. I practiced that yesterday. But also, Sheila, if you could take us on to the next slide, that would be great. So also, yes, if you're interested in learning more about what we do, or whether you'd like to work with us, either you can follow the link on the slide there, or again, use the QR code.